Welcome. My name is Lauren and I am the Communications and Partnerships Coordinator for Carbon Positive Australia. Today I'll be helping to host our event. Before we would begin, I would like to recognise that I'm hosting this webinar from Whadjuk Noongar Boodja country and recognise the traditional owners of the countries where you all work and live today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the culture and connection to country that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people hold. Today's event is Sustainability Success for Your Business, where we will be taking you through a deep dive into your carbon footprint. And it's not as scary as you might think. That's because we have two amazing speakers on hand to talk you through all you need to know about your business's carbon footprint and how to implement sustainable measures. I would like to introduce you to our facilitator, Catherine Patterson, who I work alongside. She's our Head of Partnerships at Carbon Positive Australia. With a Bachelor of Business Administration, she has completed the UN Global Accelerator on Science-Based Targets. She's an Al Gore Climate Reality Leader, the WA Leader for Parents for Climate Change, and a permaculture designer. She has worked at Carbon Positive Australia for 8 years, and before that in various commercial roles, as well as running her own small business. Catherine understands how our values, combined with a strong business strategy, can have a substantial social and environmental impact. Our guest speaker today is Andrew Moore from Lifecycle Logic. Andrew Moore is a passionate sustainability scientist and founder of Lifecycle Logic. He loves to explore the life cycles of products using Lifecycle Assessment, or sometimes known as LCA, to help his clients discover their path to sustainability. His clients include a wide range of sectors, including government, agriculture, building and construction, mining, tourism, and energy. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session. So to begin, over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. Just going to share my screen. I'm actually talking to you from the other side of the world, but I would also like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people from where I normally work, rest and play and pay my respects. So just going to quickly run through, in case you don't know us, a little bit about Carbon Positive Australia. We are not-for-profit. We've been around for 21 years, and the main job we do is we restore degraded land back to healthy ecosystems. Core to our mission is climate, and we do this through native restoration. I've been working with Carbon Positive, as Lauren says, for over 8 years now, and I've been proud to be involved in some amazing projects. So during my presentation today, I'm going to take a little bit of a deep dive into what a carbon footprint is and some of the components of it. So fundamentally, a carbon footprint or calculation is a greenhouse gas inventory of how many greenhouse gases each activity you do is creating. So emission factors are scientific metrics on an activity's greenhouse gas emissions, and it's measures in units of carbon dioxide equivalent. So obviously every activity that you do is greenhouse gas emissions. Here in Australia, national emission factors are published by the Government Department of Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water. They are updated annually to take into account any changes to take any changes that may have happened. Activities that can change national emission factors could include increased or decreased renewables to the grid and different ways of recycling. So calculator is based on these emission factors, but what we've done is we've sort of made it in an easy to use format, and the calculations for you, so you can just input your usage data. So, and our calculator is available up on our website. So the next important step to understand when you're doing a carbon footprint is to understand your activities in terms of scopes. This concept was developed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, The Greenhouse Gas Protocol supplies the world's most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standards. The scopes allow organisations to categorise activities into direct and indirect emissions, and it helps avoid double counting. So I'm going to quickly run through what the scopes are. Scope 1 are direct emissions that you create in assets that your company owns or controls, otherwise known as fuel that you burn. Examples of this could include litres of fuel consumed in company vehicles, litres of heating oil consumed from the consumption of purchased utilities. Sorry, just let me rewind a bit. And then the next one is scope 2, indirect emissions, which is fuel that your organisation buys. So this would include the electricity that you buy, steam and heat that you purchase. The next one is scope 3. Scope 3 is everything else. It's all other emissions created in the value chain of a business. Again, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has categorized these into different categories, which I'll run through now, so you can see the scope of your scope 3s. So with your downstream scope 3 emissions, it includes all purchased goods and services, capital goods, fuel and energy related activities, transport and distribution, waste generated in operations, business travel, employee commuting, and leased assets. Upstream emissions include transport and distribution, processing of sold products, there's a typo there, the use of your sold products, end of life of your products, leased assets, franchises, and investment. In most cases, the majority of emissions come from a company's scope 3 activities. And they can be a lot harder to track. Sorry. So who has to report? Australia, only our largest emitters, largest scope 1 emitters, have to report, come under the compliance market. They're covered by our safeguard mechanism. So these companies that have really high scope 1 emissions have to report on their emissions and offset anything over the baseline. Nearly everyone else comes under the voluntary market. However, quite rightly so, we're finding that there is increased demand for global investment to demonstrate what you're doing about your emissions and ability. This has led to some changes in reporting standards. So what has recently happened is the International Financial Reporting Standards have formed the International Sustainability Standards Board, otherwise known as the ISSB. The ISSB amalgamates a number of other reporting standards, including the Task Force on Climate, a number of other standards into one. And as of 2024, it will be releasing 2 new standards. The first standard defines the requirements for companies to communicate their sustainability related risks and opportunities. And the second standard sets out specific climate related disclosure requirements covering a holistic climate strategy. These are voluntary, but they will be adopted throughout jurisdictions, as I mentioned, from 2024. And what these standards ultimately mean is companies need to have a better understanding of their scope 3 emissions. And what it might mean for you if you have a smaller business is that you might form part of the value chain for another organization, and you might be part of their scope 3 emissions. And they will quite likely like to know what you are doing about your emissions. Talk a little bit about certification, as we do get quite a few questions on this. Here in Australia, Climate Active is our certifying body for carbon neutral. It's part government run, part business run, and it can certify a business as being carbon neutral. It can certify a product as being carbon neutral. It can certify an event as being carbon neutral. So if you go to their website, you might see some companies listed. It might not mean that everything within that organization is carbon neutral. As I said, it could be an element of it, but I think that is about to change. I'm also going to briefly talk about science-based targets. These are not certification. They are, I guess, sort of best practice on how to reach net zero using the latest science. So they provide a clearly defined path or framework for companies to set net zero ambitions. I just want to say, as we sort of mentioned before, most people fall under the voluntary system for doing certification. So I would highly recommend, while I think it's really great to perhaps pursue a certification or to do a science-based target, is more important to actually just start doing something and start measuring. And that is something that you can start to do in-house. As I sort of said, using some of the calculations that are out there, or looking at investing in environmental projects. So you can start doing things in-house immediately, and then start building up to this. On our own website and on our course, we offer a tip sheet on how to start calculating your business footprint. And I'm just going to quickly run through what's involved in starting a business footprint for those of you who want to start and doing it. So carbon footprint calculations are done for a period of time. So the first thing you need to do is set your baseline period. So, to sort of say, right, we want to start measuring our emissions for the last financial year. Then you start collecting your data. So the data would obviously, it's normally, I would say most cases best to start with activities that contribute to your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and then any scope 3 emissions that have a large impact on your business. So you can work out by setting your base layer, it gives you something that you can start measuring on and start tracking against. Generally, we find one of the obstacles in starting your carbon footprint is actually starting to collect your data and get accurate sources. So obviously, this is something that you need to work toward. How do you get the data that you need to put to measure your activities? Once you start tracking what you're actually consuming, you can put measures in place to start reducing. And I just wanted to quickly talk about this because a lot of people think that starting to measure their footprint or taking action has to be quite radical, which obviously it can work towards, but things can start quite simply. It can be setting a policy and education program in your office about turning things off, about consuming less. So everyone in your organization gets an idea of where you want to head to. It could be implementing a recycle program, and it could be facilitating people to work and travel in a different way to and from work or to business meetings. So you can start something off quite simply. Some of these steps that we've given on how to reduce your carbon footprint can apply at home or in your office or business place. I also just, on this side, I just wanted to talk about the difference between reducing and offsetting. Reducing and offsetting are not the same thing. Offsetting is paying for reductions elsewhere in the economy to compensate for the emissions that you create as a business or individual. It does work. There are some amazing offset projects. It really does work, but it's not the same as reducing. Reducing is looking at your own footprint and seeing if you can make it smaller. And I guess sort of lastly, investment is also something slightly different. Investment is investing in infrastructure that mitigates the impacts of climate change, which could include forest and biodiversity. And I also wanted to talk about within science-based targets, they don't allow for offsetting as part of your reduction strategy. However, they do encourage you to offset you're reducing to help mitigate the effects of climate change and obviously invest in things that are going to make us have a better future. There is a new buzzword that's coming around, a new phenomenon, and it's called green hushing. What we're finding progressively is that companies are stopping taking action, stopping to do anything because they are worried about being called out for greenwashing. Now, obviously, greenwashing is not a great thing and it is legitimate, but we really don't want that to stop you taking action. At the moment, it's really important that we all start taking climate action. We've seen global weather events happening throughout this year, and we're predicting a really hot summer. So obviously the importance of us all doing something it's there, now is the time for action. And what's really important to remember is that we do have the solutions and we all have capacity to implement something. But what I would say, it's really important to communicate accurately. And it's recommended that you go over and beyond what you're actually communicating out there. So make sure you have a clear action plan on what your sustainability strategy is and that you have means to track how you're going against it. Okay. I want to talk about the power of small changes. I recently went to a presentation by Greg Roskal, who does the War on Waste and that there's no planet B. He talked about, he went to a hotel one day and he noticed that within his hotel fridge, they were storing a small bottle of long life milk. So he did a carbon calculation on what would happen if those 200 fridges were turned off. And it really is quite staggering. It really, sorry, I'll go back. I've lost it. Now, I have to say, I've made a few assumptions within this calculation. I've looked at the wattage of a fridge, which is obviously the electricity that it uses. And I've done it that it's at maximum usage for 8 hours a day. And I've done it on our WA grid. So there's things that will change within this calculation. But it basically showed a saving of 28,000, and it also resulted in 17 cars being removed from the road. So again, when I'm saying, when you think about sustainability or implementing any sort of reduction strategy, doing some small things can really make a big impact, and we can all be doing that. Oh, sorry, guys. We're launching a short course as of tomorrow, which is Sustainability Success for Your Business. It has an overview of the Australian carbon market. It also runs through carbon accounting in brief, and also what's happening in the international reporting standards. So that's available as of tomorrow, and you'll be sent an email about it. It's a really worthwhile short course if you're looking for something sort of really brief to bring you up to speed on everything that's going on. So that ends my section, and I'm very excited now to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Moore from Lifecycle Assessments. He works as a consultant in this area. He's going to take a little deep dive into what goes into the carbon footprint of things, products and services that we buy. I'm very excited for this. I've always wanted to learn more. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now and hand it over. And I'd also like to thank Andrew now for giving his time very generously to this webinar to help educate us on this subject.
Always helps to unmute. So can you guys see my presentation there? Does the share come through okay? Okay, great. So I just dive straight in, going back to when I first got into life cycle assessment. So I find that's a great way to introduce everyone else to it. So back in 2007, I'd quit my job and gone back to do a master's in renewable energy at Murdoch University. And sitting in the professor's office, there was this question on his list of topics. Does solar PV take more energy to manufacture than they will ever generate? So for someone who just quit their job and poured their life savings into going back to university, this was not a great question to see hadn't been answered. So this became my master's topic, to look at the life cycle of solar to answer this question. So to answer the question, you can't just look at part of the life cycle, you have to look at the whole life cycle. And the basic framework for life cycle assessment is to break it down into the production, the use, and the end of life, often called disposal, and then quantify the manufacturing and processing and transport steps throughout the whole life cycle to give you this total energy that went in to make it in the first place. So if you look at where a solar panel comes from, it starts as a quartz rock that gets blasted with explosives, dug out of the ground, stuck on trucks to be moved to crushers. When it's then transported often long distances via rail or sea to where it's turned into silicon metal. So there you take the quartz, you throw it into an electric arc furnace, blast it with an electric arc, throw some carbon-based material in at the same time, and then the carbon reacts with the silicon, because the silicon dioxide is quartz is silicon dioxide. You want to keep the silicon and get rid of the carbon, the oxygen. So the carbon material bonds to the oxygen, goes off with CO2, leaving you with your pure silicon metal. And then you have to go through further processing steps in order to eventually get your solar cell. So to do the life cycle assessment on the solar panel, I had to look at each of these production steps, look at all of the chemical and energy inputs and all of the emission outputs at every stage and quantify those. And then obviously there's more than just the solar cell. You've got the conduction fingers and bus bars on the cell, anti-reflective coatings. Then you need multiple solar cells to make a panel. So it's typically around 72 cells now to make a solar panel, and they all get laminated between a backing sheet of EVA and a glass front that all gets squashed together with pressure and heat, and then framed with an aluminium frame before having the junction box and wires added on the back. And the whole thing goes typically in a cardboard box with another panel ready to be shipped around the world. So I had to look at not just the production of the panel itself, but also the magic box, the inverter that enables it to connect to the grid, and then also look at the energy that it would generate over the life of the panel. So if we look at the energy inputs, we've got the manufacturing is the little factory, the use stage is the solar panels, and then the end of life. For a 1 kilowatt system, it takes around 2,700 kilowatt hours of energy to make it in the first place. But over the life of the panels in Perth, and this is going back into 2007 when I did my study, then the system would generate around 18 times more energy than it took to make it in the first place. The energy payback period was around 2 years. So that's, the system had to operate for 2 years before generating that 2,700 kilowatt hours of electricity that took to make it in the first place. You can see over the 30 plus potential year life of the system, it's a relatively small part. If we compare it to the greenhouse gas emissions from the WA grid, at the time, it was around 980 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. But since this study was done, that's come down. And at the time, the solar was around 43 grams per kilowatt hour. So the two things to note here: one, it's significantly different than the grid, and two, it's not zero to make your solar panel in the first place. Often there's myths that are perpetuated that renewable energy is zero carbon or electric cars are zero carbon. They're not. They're significantly less. But it's come down since I've updated this chart. But at the same time, solar has also improved because all the solar manufacturers started using the life cycle assessment to look at the whole life cycle of their product and see where they could make significant reductions. So yeah, so they've come down significantly as well. So the life cycle assessment can definitely be used to target these environmental questions and bust myths. So a quick definition, LCA or life cycle assessment is a scientific method to provide quantified environmental information over the life cycle of the product. So it's really important that the focus is on the quantification. It's very data intensive, but there's software you use to help manage all of that. And it is over the whole life cycle of the product typically. So looking at the production, the use, and the end of life. So this basic framework here, I refer to that as like the handrails, because when you're doing life cycle assessment, you literally go down the rabbit hole to explore where products have come from. And then when you find where those products have come from and how they're manufactured, then there's other things that feed into the production process as well. So it's literally a branched series of rabbit warrens that go deep, deep, deep. And it can be very difficult sometimes to pull your head out of the detail and get back to the surface of actually finishing your project and not just doing it indefinitely. So some lingo around the scope boundaries. If it's not a full life cycle assessment, it's often called a cradle to gate. So a lot of manufacturers now are being asked to study their product up to their gate, after which it becomes input into someone else's product, or it goes direct to the consumer, and then they can quantify that part of it. If it includes the whole life cycle, then it's often called a cradle to grave or a cradle to cradle study. So those ones are typically used if you're going to compare, say, your product with a competitor or an average product because you're wanting to make claims of being better than theirs. So life cycle assessment is a bit different from carbon footprinting in that it doesn't just look at climate change. It looks at a whole range of different environmental impacts all at the same time. This is a high-level summary of, there's now around 29 indicators that are typically reported for LCAs, and to throw another acronym into EPDs, which an EPD is a summary of a more detailed LCA study that's been done to specific product category rules. So in an EPD, you report these 29 different indicators, not just carbon. And this is more and more what companies, if they're requesting things from their suppliers, they're often going to be requesting their full suite of environmental information. And there's the science is progressing, so there's new indicators being developed all of the time. So a new one that's being developed at the moment is microplastics. So you can look at where the microplastics come from across the whole life cycle as well, and implement measures to reduce those. So who's doing product LCA? A good place to find out who's doing it is, I'm not going to put a whole lot of manufacturers here who are doing it, but pretty much all of the large multinationals have been doing it for quite some time, probably up to 20 years. All the car manufacturers, phone manufacturers, computer manufacturers, they've all been doing it. So you're better off to go to either one of these websites, go to the Climate Active Carbon Neutral program, and you can have a look at who's been registered there for carbon neutral products, or you can go to the EPD, or Environmental Product Declaration Australasia website, and have a look at all of the organisations that are putting their information on there. So the big drive for EPDs in Australia at the moment is the building and construction space. So if you're wanting to build a green building, or you've got a product that's going to feed into a green building, in order to get Green Star points, the products that go into the building need to ideally have EPDs, providing that background primary data on what their impacts are. So that's like concrete, bricks, steel, all of the inputs that go into building and construction projects. So I'll give you a quick example of a company that I've been working with now for a little while, MJ Bale. They're a menswear brand. So they work with at the farm level as well to get high quality fibers that then go through to be produced into garments. So everything you can see in here, clothes wise, they don't make couches. But this is one of the new stores they opened in Melbourne. They've got around 80 outlets now in Australia. So they came to me in 2019 and said they wanted to be quantify all of their carbon footprint, not just for the organisation, the carbon footprint for each and every one of their products. So we looked for each one of the products. It was a huge job. We went through and looked at the fibres that went to make up the garments, whether that's wool for a suit jacket or the cotton for the shirt. We then traced it to where it would actually be turned into the fabric. So a lot of it, so for their wool, a lot of it comes from Tasmania and then goes to Italy to be made into fabric before going on to China or Japan to be sewn into garments, which are then packaged and sent to Australia, and the logistics partners send them around Australia to the different retail outlets. So we covered all of these different stages, from fibres to the retail, and then the end of life of the garment as well. The use stage of the washing of the garments has been excluded at this stage, but we will be quantifying that in more detail as part of the SBTI, the Science Based Targets program, as we progress down that path. So that enabled us to quantify the carbon footprint of each of the items, whether they're part of the suits, the casuals range, accessories, or the shirts. So at this stage, where we've published the carbon footprint values on a group level, but as we progress, we're going to be starting to put individual carbon footprint labels on each item. They're going to that much finer level of granularity. So the most important thing is that now that we've got this map of the supply chain and map of where the carbon emissions are coming from, it enables us to target, not just the hotspots, but each part of the life cycle to come up with reduction initiatives. So for the retail outlets, obviously their electricity consumption was the biggest thing. So they wanted to have that as a 1 year target, that by the end of that year, they would have converted each of the retail stores across to renewable energy. But they actually achieved that within the first 3 months of rolling out the initiative. So that had a significant reduction of the carbon footprint associated with the retail side of it. So we're going and doing that throughout every part of the supply chain, and importantly, working with supply chain partners. We're not just picking and choosing and getting rid of partners that have got a higher footprint, or getting rid of fibres that have got a higher footprint. We work with those farmers, with the suppliers, to help them reduce the emissions at a fundamental level. So for EPDs, just give you a quick rundown of what an EPD is. So an EPD is an independently verified document that communicates transparent and comparable environmental information of a product over the whole life cycle. So the important distinction between doing a carbon footprint and an EPD is the EPD has a more complete suite of environmental information. So just some quick examples from the EPD Australasia website. You can see we've got ColourBond steel, we've got Wood Solutions timber, and Boral, it's premixed concrete mixes for Perth. So if you're wanting to know exactly what the environmental impacts were associated with a specific concrete mix, you can go to this EPD and see that specific information. And you can use that then to choose a mix for your project, which has a much lower carbon footprint. So for our house, when we did our renovation, along with all the other crazy people that did renovations around COVID, I used this information to choose a concrete mix for our slab that had a carbon footprint that was less than half. It was about a 60% reduction from the standard mix. So that it enables you to make those decisions. And as I said, it's not just carbon in an EPD, it's looking at a whole suite of different environmental impacts all at the same time. So the EPD is a summary document of the more detailed LCA that's done. The LCA itself is about typically 100 pages, and the EPD is typically about 10. So it's a more graphically designed document it's better to read than the hardcore LCA science. So it often describes what the scope of the study is, and then here you can see a detailed summary of the result tables, which they can be hard to go through if you're not familiar with the numbers and what the impact categories are. But there are new tools that are helping you go through that process and do comparisons. So if you're wanting to, if you're an organisation that wants to do it yourself, do get your own carbon footprint and register, you can go through Climate Active and register with their program. Or if you're looking at producing an EPD, it can be published with the EPD Australasia. But for smaller organisations, these are often good sources of information to go when you're quantifying your own carbon footprint. So you can find out what the carbon footprint of things are through the Climate Active or the EPD information. So yeah, if anyone has any questions that we can't cover today, feel free to email Catherine or Lauren, or you can send me an email as well. I'm more than happy to answer anyone's questions.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thank you, Catherine, for your time. And thanks to everyone who has attended. So we're going to go into a quick round of Q&A. So we've had quite a few questions come through. So I'm going to kick this first round of questions. I've broken them down into questions for you, Catherine, and then questions for yourself, Andrew. So Catherine, we'll start with you. This question is, can you please define green hushing and greenwashing?
Yes, well, I'd say the best place, the CCC have just a publication on greenwashing, and I would highly recommend, probably going through and reviewing their definition. It's published up on their website. In terms of green hushing, I guess it's a sort of phenomenon, and it's, I guess, sort of not, I don't think sort of being technically defined, but I think it's a bit of a phenomenon where that's being discussed at the moment, of people companies stopping action because they're not quite sure what to do. But I think, as to my presentation, I think, there's a lot of things that are happening to try and make this an easier space for organisations to work in within standardisations. And as I sort of said, go to the ACCC's site to sort of look at the information that they define for greenwashing, because it is important if your organisation is putting out any communications.
Awesome, thank you. So your next question is, what do I need to calculate my carbon footprint?
For me, is that right for me?
Yes, for yourself, yeah.
So it really depends on how far you are going to go on your carbon footprint. So if we look back at the scopes that I talked about in my presentation, as I said, quite often people might start with scope 1, which is your direct emissions. That could be looking at your output from your like your fugitive emissions from air conditioning, or if you're burning fuel. In a lot of smaller organizations, that would be vehicles you own. Obviously, that would be different if you're a power plant for your scope 1 emissions. Scope 2, as I said, is fuel that you buy. So there would you need your electricity bills, and or any oil that's consumed on site. And then we start looking into scope 3. So I think in terms of collecting that data, it depends on which journey you want to take, I guess. But if you are sort of saying, right, we want to start doing something for ourselves, we want to start tracking, we want to start doing it, or we're looking at climate certification, you generally start looking at your scope 3 in terms of what scope 3s have a large impact on your organization or business, risk, opportunities for change, maybe what scope 3s have the biggest emission factor for your organization. So you'd probably look at tackling them first. So when you start collecting that data, you could be starting to look at your waste footprint, how many tons of waste that you generate. As I said, it's a little bit, it's a difficult question to answer, because it depends on, I guess, sort of what scope you're putting around what you're going to do. But again, if anyone would like to sort of discuss best sort of individual level, probably best to get in contact.
Perfect. A couple more questions for you, Kath. This one is, can I calculate my footprint for an upcoming event my business is running?
Yes, absolutely, you can. And if you were looking at an event, the sort of data that you would need to collect, it depends on what kind of event, but you'd be looking at again, the scope of of which you want to do the carbon footprint. You might want to start with your scope 1, 2, and then move to your scope 3. Aspects that go into an event's carbon footprint would be travel, how people are getting there, obviously energy consumed, your waste. It could go as far as accommodation, but it would include food, drinks that are consumed. So they would be elements that would go into the event's carbon footprint. But it's defining, again, how much, where you'd like to take your footprint to.
Perfect. And last question that's been asked here, is being carbon positive better to aim towards than aiming towards working towards being carbon neutral?
Yes. I guess carbon positive is, the name of our organization, but in essence, it is doing more than being carbon neutral. Carbon neutral is essentially, I mean, there's no defined terminology out there, but it really does mean that you're in a sort of status quo, that your emissions are balanced out with emissions that you sort of offset or reduce. So carbon positive or climate positive is really looking where you're going beyond that to further reduce and do something positive for the environment as well. So, you're going over and beyond.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kath. Over to you, Andrew. We've got a few questions here. Someone has asked, how can performing a life cycle assessment benefit my business?
That's a great question. So in all of the LCA studies I've done, they're not typically a cheap exercise, but the return that the businesses get is there's hotspots, but often the financial hotspots as well. So to give you a more practical example, there was a steel company that I was working with, and they'd never bothered to quantify where the electricity consumption was being consumed in their business. But as part of the LCA, we did exactly that. And turned out that their lighting in their warehouse, which was on all the time, and it wasn't LED lighting, it was the old style, inefficient lighting, that was actually a significant consumer of electricity that had a really quick financial payback. So not only did they end up with a lower carbon footprint, they ended up with a really quick financial payback as well. So this is where not just looking for the environmental wins, but looking for the financial wins is a really great benefit of LCAs. And another example, when you've got organisation where people working in different silos, often there's not the opportunity for them to come together. So there's been many examples where in doing the kickoff meeting before doing the life cycle assessment study, we bring everyone into the room to discuss what we're doing, because I need to get data from different people in the manufacturing process. And often we'll say, well, there was one example where steel was produced out of the mill and it was boiling hot, and they would send it off into the yard to cool it before it went on to the next production step. And then those guys, when they went and got it out the yard, the first thing they did was they needed it to be molten, so they had to heat it up again. So getting them both in the room at the same time, they said, just seems like completely obvious. Why don't we just send it straight from one production step to the other without it cooling down in the middle? So by doing that, they saved a huge amount of energy. So LCA gets the people together in the room as well to have these, which are often really basic discussions to improve the energy efficiency and reduce the environmental impacts.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And another question here is, when it comes to a life cycle assessment, what's an easy way for me to request info from my suppliers? How can I get them to help me?
Send them an email, get on the phone, schedule a meeting to go and see them. The reason why I got into life cycle assessment, working in this space in the first place, was that Volkswagen in Germany had requested information from their steel suppliers in China and Japan, who in turn asked their iron ore suppliers in WA what their impacts were. So there was this sort of message got passed up the chain, and then the iron ore producers had to start looking at what their life cycle impacts were, so that they could supply it all through to Volkswagen. So there's a lot of power in just asking the question in the first place. We've been surprised in the work with most of the companies I've worked with, but like for a specific example, MJ Bale, often they're working with big partners, but even though they're just a small, MJ Baylor is a relatively small organisation, just asking that question and demonstrating what you're doing can provide a lot of leadership and have influence upstream. But yeah, it starts out with a conversation, and ideally you do that in person if you can.
Perfect. And lastly, are more consumers looking to support or purchase from organisations that have completed a life cycle assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Australia, we've always been a long way behind Europe. Europe is moving towards having every single product that is sold in the EU having a life cycle assessment done on it and having environmental product declaration information provided. The US is also moving in that direction rapidly as part of the Build Back Better. They've put billions of dollars into the development of APDs, and Australia is still voluntary, but we're still moving at a great pace here in Australia as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. A huge thank you to both yourself and Catherine for answering some of the attendees' questions this afternoon. So that concludes our event for this afternoon. Before you all switch off and leave for this afternoon, we will be sending an email out tomorrow with a recap of this event. If you have any questions as well, you can respond to that email, but within that email, we'll also be emailing out information regarding our course that Catherine mentioned in her talk. And we will have a special offer for anyone who has attended the event today for that course. So once again, thank you everyone for your time, and we hope you found this session informative and valuable. Thank you so much.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you. So, thanks again, Andrew.